Welcome to Crack It. Today we are going to see a very interesting and an important topic, which is nothing but REST API versioning. So, when we are using RESTful API or REST web services in our application, it's very important to understand how we can version our APIs and why do we need to do versioning and when do we need to do versioning of our APIs. This is a very common interview question if you are working in the RESTful APIs, like how do you version your API, which specific versioning you're following in your application. So this is a very common interview question you may expect in your interview. So let's start the discussion. Before that, we have started this channel new, so we request you to support our channel through your likes, shares, comments, and subscriptions if you like the content. Why and when do we need versioning for our APIs? First of all, to fix the bugs. Suppose say I have prod released my API and the users or the consumers of an API identified that there is some issue with the API response. So, and I need to correct my API. I need to accommodate that change in my API. How can I do that? I can do that using the API versioning. So, what I can do is in my next version in which I'm going to fix my bugs, in that version, I can change my response data as my user expected. Why and when do we need versioning to our APIs? First is to fix bugs. Suppose say I have prod released my API and the consumers of my API had find some issue in the response that I have sent. How can I fix it? How can I accommodate the change that they want? Suppose let's consider this one. Suppose I have a field called name wherein my consumer wants me to change it to first name. They considered this as a bug, but they are consuming this API currently. I have prod released it, and but they want me to change this name to first name. Let's consider we don't have any versioning in place. So what will I do? I will just delete or remove this property, or I will rename this property from name to first name and I'll send back to my consumer. So and I will prod release the API. My consumer currently their code is consuming this property name but not first name. So they will expect the property name as name, and that will break their API. Why? Because I'm not responding with the field name, but they are expecting that field to be name. So which may cause some confusion with the consumers. So to avoid that, we need to introduce versioning. Suppose say what will I do? I have versioning in place. So my version 1's response has the field as name and my version 2's response has field as first name. Suppose my consumer is calling with version v1, they will get the response as name, and if my consumer is calling my version v2, they will get the response with the field first name. So in this way we can avoid the problems with the consumers, or we can fix the bugs that our code has. Next is deprecating the old functionality. Suppose say I have an endpoint and I no longer need it. Suppose I have an endpoint to get a product or suppose say I have a endpoint wherein I'm updating the product with the product's database ID, but I don't want to expose my database ID to anyone. So what I'm doing is I'm going to deprecate my update endpoint with the database ID, and I want to replace that with a new feature, new API, wherein I am pausing a product reference, which can be viewed by the user, since that is not a database ID. So for that, let's assume I have deprecated my old functionality without any versioning. I have just removed it, but and I didn't inform the consumers. So what will happen if they try to access that endpoint? There may be a chance that they will get 404 error status, 404 error, which is not found. So How can this be avoided? This can avoid it by using a proper API versioning. Next is adding a new features. Suppose say there's no versioning in place in my application, and in my existing endpoint I have a field called key, which is not a mandatory field in my request body, but I am changing that API. In that API, what I am doing, I am making this key as a mandatory parameter. My consumer is calling my API wherein they are not sending me the key because this is an optional field in my previous implementation, but now I have changed it to mandatory. So I am throwing them with a response saying that 400 bad request. Why? Because this is a mandatory parameter and you are not sending it, but my consumer is not aware of it. If suppose I have versioning in place, what I can do is in my version 1, say let's assume in my version 1 I can have that field as an optional. In V2 I can have that field as a mandatory, and over time I can deprecate V1 and I can make use of this V2 version. So for all these uses, for fixing the bugs or deprecating the old functionality or adding a new features, versioning is really important, and this is why we need that. Okay, now let's try to understand what the breaking change in an API is. Suppose say changing the request or response format. What is it? Suppose say my API is currently responding with a XML format. Now I have changing it to respond to a JSON format. This is a breaking change. Why? Because my entire the request or the response format is changing. So this is a breaking change. So what next? Changing a property name. Changing this name to a product name. This is a breaking change. This we discussed already. Why? Because the consumer will expect with the name, but I am changing it to product name. So this is a breaking change. And let's consider, currently my name is a string, but I want to change, but in my next implementation in the product name I have changed it to a integer. This is a breaking change. This will cause problem to the consumer. And what next? Adding a required field on the request. This also we discussed. Suppose say I have a field name which is optional, but I am changing it to a mandatory field. This is a breaking change. Next, removing a property on the response. Yes, I have a property name and that was consumed by consumer, and they are using doing some manipulation with that property and they are using it. But all of a sudden, if I am not sending this property at all, what will happen? That is a breaking change. So we now know what is a breaking change. Why I'm explaining what are the breaking changes is we are going to understand what semantic versioning is, and for this semantic versioning we need to understand what a breaking change is. This is a very important interview question that you may expect in your interview, which is nothing but semantic versioning. Interviewers may not ask directly what semantic versioning is. Instead, you may expect what type of versioning you are using in your API. So you may always say semantic versioning, and what semantic versioning is, we are versioning our API in 3 digits, which is major, minor and patch. If there is a patch version going on, suppose let's say, then my API version will change from 100 to 101. If there is a minor patch, what will happen? Minor change, what will happen? Then my API version will change to 111. If there is a major change, my API version will get changed to 200. So in this way, we will use, in most of the applications, we will use versioning. Let's now discuss what patch, minor and major is. So what is patch versioning? If we are making any patch changes to our API, so what is that patch changes? Patch changes are nothing but bug fixing, performance improvement, environment changes, or any internal tweaks. So all these will come in the patch versioning. Suppose say I have a method which is performing really bad, which is taking 5000 milliseconds to respond, but I have did something. I have fine-tuned my query, or I have used asynchronous methods. I have did something to make my method to perform better. Now my performance has been increased from 5000 milliseconds to 500 milliseconds. But there is no change in my request body or the parameters or the path variables or the response. I have no change. but I have improved my performance. This type of changes is called as patch. So if you see, patch updates are interchangeable. What does that mean? Even if the consumer can use either 1.0.0 or 1.0.1. It is their wish completely, but it is always suggested to update the version. And also it depends upon the consumer to upgrade the version or downgrade. It is completely up to the consumer, but it is always suggested to update. This is the patch versioning. So nothing got changed, but I have did something to make my code look better or to make my code to work better. That will come in the patch versioning. So my API will change from 100 to 101. Next, so what is minor versioning? So minor versioning is nothing but if there is any new feature added or new end or an existing endpoint deprecated, all these will come under minor versioning. Suppose if you see here, I have 3 APIs here: to retrieve a product, create products, and update products. But I have added 2 new features: delete product and retrieve product based on the product ID. So this we will say as minor versioning. Why this is a minor versioning? Because I have added some new features. That is why it will come under a minor versioning. So my API versioning will change from 100 to 110. Minor updates are always backward compatible. So we can that minor updates are backward compatible means like this will not throw any issues even if we use 100 or 111. So minor updates are backward compatible. And if you see, let's see an example for endpoint declared deprecated. So I have an endpoint here, retrieve based on the product ID, but this is like my database ID, which I don't want. So what I'm doing, I'm deprecating retrieving based on product ID, and I have created a new endpoint, retrieve based on product reference. This will also come under the minor versioning. So I'll just we need to add as we will inform them that this is going to be deprecated. So this will come under minor versioning. So we will inform them that this is going to be deprecated and a new endpoint has been added to replace this functionality, wherein please don't send me the database ID. I don't want to let you know. So please use this product reference. This will come under minor update. So my API version will change from 100 to 110 and from 110 to 120, because minor is the middle value. That is why this value is getting updated. Next is major versioning. Major versioning is for the breaking changes. For all the breaking changes, we'll go for the major changes, major versioning. I've just explained breaking changes just few minutes before in the same video. And so let's try to understand what how will our API versioning will change. So I have API versioning as 120, but I want, if I am doing a prod deployment of an application, my API version will get changed to 200. Why? Because I have introduced some breaking changes to my API. So let's try to understand what are the breaking changes. Change API endpoint name or signature. So for example, I have a retrieve products wherein I was using slash what can I say, slash crackit slash products, but I am changing that my endpoint to slash crackit techie talks slash products, which is a change in API. So if my consumer call my API with slash crackit slash products, that API will not be available here. So what will happen? They will get 404, which is a breaking change. So for all these breaking changes, what we need to do, we need to create a new version of our API and we need to expose. So whenever the consumer is ready to consume this version, they will change their version from 1.20 2.0 to 2.0.0. This is called as the major version. So the consumers should also be ready or change their code accordingly to use this updated version. This will come in the major changes. And major changes are non-compatible. Consumers cannot upgrade without changing their software where applicable. As I told earlier, if they are using 1 to O and they are calling the products with /products. So if without changing their code, if suppose they are started consuming 200, they will get 404 only, which is not expected and they don't want. So they have to change their code accordingly. Where they are calling their retail products, they need to change the code to /products. Then they can start using this updated API. What next? Suppose say I've removed delete product. Previously the consumer was using that endpoint, but I have removed it for some reason. This will come under a breaking change. Also, previously, if you remember in my minor versioning, I have mentioned that I'm going to deprecate this endpoint, and I have deprecated it here. So all these will come in the major changes. And for this, as I told earlier, no backward compatibility. So we just now saw what semantic versioning is, and you may be asked what type of strategy you are using for the versioning in your REST application. So what are the types of, or what are the strategies that are available for versioning? So URI versioning, query parameter versioning, custom header versioning, and content negotiation versioning. So I've explained these three in this video, and I will cover content negotiation versioning alone in a separate, maybe in a next video. Content negotiation versioning is mainly used in Spring Boot REST APIs, and this is very common these days. So I want to explain it with an example or a demo. So I'll cover this topic in my next video. To make a better understanding, or to make it really clear, I'll explain it through demo. So let's now start understand the other three strategies. So what is URI versioning? So URI versioning, this is a straightforward method. It's like very simple. So in our URI of the REST APIs, we will mention the version. So if you see these two APIs, you will be able to easily understand that this API is version 1 and this is version 2. So this is a very most straightforward approach. But this is not recommended. Why this is not recommended? Because URIs should always represent the resource and not the version. So this URI versioning is not recommended, but this URI versioning is followed by many organizations. This is, even though this is not recommended by REST architecture, many organizations still follow this URI versioning for versioning their REST APIs. And what are the benefits of using this URI versioning? As we see, we can understand in which version we are. So it is very easy to implement and it is easy to understand as well. So clear separation of API versions in the URL. In the URL itself, we are able to understand which version we are using for the specific API. These are the pros. And what is cons? Cons we already told, this is not recommended. And next is, this can lead to clutter the URL. So suppose say my URL is really big. Let's consider /product ID, and inside the product I'm going to check /references /reference ID, and inside the reference I'm going to check something else. So my already my URI is really big. I'm adding versioning to it. I'm burdening the URI by providing the version. So it may lead to clutter the URL, which will lead to harder to read endpoints. So these are the cons. URI versioning, what is it? It is a very straightforward approach. We will provide the versions in the URI. This is URI versioning. Next, what is query parameter versioning? As the name suggests, we will provide the versions in the query params. If you see here, I'm providing anything after question mark is query params or request parameters. So I'm providing my version in the query parameter. This is called as query parameter versioning. And this is also a clear understanding. Why? Because we are providing the versions in our API. So this method also provides a clear separation of API versions, but avoids changing the URI. My URL is not get changed, but I am just changing the value of the query parameter. This is a pros. This is an advantage for me, and it is also easy to implement. And what are the cons? Can lead to long and complex URLs. Yes, as we told earlier, my URL, there may be a chance that my URL will be really big, but I'm adding versioning also as a request parameter, which will make my URL big. Suppose say I have one more parameter, or I'm passing 3 parameters. So what will happen? My URL will be like a clutter and it will look complex. So this is the disadvantage. What is query parameter versioning? Passing the versions as query params. Next, custom header versioning. Custom header versioning is also like really simple. So we will add one header. This is like a custom header. We can give it as any name and we will provide the version to it. So this is called as custom header versioning. It may be X-version, it may be X-V, it may X API version. It is, the naming is like based on our consumers or based on our organization decides. We can give the name. This is a custom header and we need to provide the version in that header, which we all agreed. Consumer is agreed, we are agreed, we both are agreed. That name we have to provide here. So this versioning is to include the version number in the HTTP headers of the API request. We will provide our versioning in the HTTP headers. And this is like this follows REST principle, because this method adheres to the principle of REST architecture, as the URI remains focused on the resource. So if you see these two, here also we are using in the URI, here also it is a part of the URL. But here if you see, it is not at all part of the URL. It is really separate. We are providing this in our headers. So this follows REST architecture. This adheres to the principle of the REST architecture. This is the biggest advantage in this. The same thing, since this is not focused on the URI will focus on the resource and not on the versioning. And what is a disadvantage? This is not intuitive as other methods. Yes, it is true. Why? Because like just by seeing the URL, we will not know what the version is. So this is not intuitive as other methods. And also this requires like a little more effort to inspect the API request. Why I need to inspect the API request? Because my version is hidden in the headers. So only in my request body header I will pass this. So I need to inspect that API request. This is also, which will take little more effort. This is also effort. This is also a little disadvantage, but biggest advantage this has. What is it? It adheres to REST principles. Why is it adheres to REST principles? URL is doing what it is meant for. It is just focused on the resource. That's why. Next is content negotiation versioning. As I mentioned earlier, we will see this in our next video. This is like very common versioning used in these days. I want to show it with a live demo on how it works. So I didn't explain this in this video. In short terms, what content negotiation is like, we will send the versioning in the accept headers along with the type of the response and the versioning. That is called as content negotiation versioning. I'll explain that in a separate video with a demo, which will make it like really clear for understanding. Next is like, let's see what are the best practices that we need to do for REST API versioning. This will be a damn sure question you'll get in your interview if you're going to attend interview for the REST web services. If RESTful web services is there in your resume, you may expect this question. What are the best practices that you are using in your application for REST API versioning? First is, we need to communicate changes clearly. What is it? Suppose I'm making a breaking change. Let's consider I'm a breaking change. It's really important for me to let the consumers know that I'm going to introduce this breaking change. So I need to provide them a detailed release note or the migration guides or the API documentation to them well ahead, so that they will have enough time to upgrade their version. So that's really must. We need to communicate our consumers on what are the changes we are going to make. Also, we need to give them the enough time to prepare them for the update. Second is using semantic versioning. Yes, we just saw what semantic versioning is. It's always good to use semantic versioning, which is nothing but major, minor, dot patch. So that why do we need to use this semantic versioning? Why this is a best practice? Because this will help users to understand the impact of the update. So whether it is a patch or minor or major, which will make them easily understand what is the impact of the change that we made. So it is always best to use semantic versioning. Next is maintain backward compatibility when possible. So suppose it's always good to avoid breaking changes instead of it's always good. Why? Because we have to strive hard to maintain backward compatibility. How we can achieve that? So instead of doing changes in the existing API, we can create a new API wherein we can make all that change. So suppose if we are going to create a new parameter in our API, existing API, so we can make a default value for that new parameter, or we can introduce new endpoints for our new features. So it's always good to avoid breaking changes. I know it is not possible, but still it's good to avoid. Why it's good to avoid? So that we can maintain backward compatibility in our application. Next is deprecating old changes gradually. So we have decided to deprecate a API, but it is always good to deprecate it gradually. We first need to let the consumers know that we are going to deprecate that endpoint. Till deprecating that endpoint, suppose say I'm going to deprecate an endpoint after 2 months, I need to let my consumers know that I'm going to deprecate that endpoint in 2 months, so that they will get enough time to make modifications in their API to avoid calling the endpoint which I'm deprecating. Also, they will get enough time for migrating their code to the new version and not the old version. And also it's always it's a must to maintain like to add this in our documentation that this endpoint is going to be deprecated. So documentation is also necessary. This is implementing a versioning strategy that suits your new needs. So we can use any type of versioning strategy, say URI versioning or request param versioning or header versioning or content negotiation versioning, any versioning strategies that we can use in our application. But that strategy that we are following should be easy for the API developers who are creating the API, and that should satisfy the users' needs as well. So choosing a versioning strategy is really important, and that versioning strategy should best suit our needs and the needs of the users. So that's like really important. Also, we need to have it in mind that we need to adhere the REST principles and the impact on our API's URL when deciding on a versioning strategy. So these are the best practices that we need to follow for REST API versioning. So with this, we come to the end of REST API versioning. We have like finished seeing what does mean by REST API versioning, why do we need, when do we need, and what semantic versioning is, and what are the strategies that is involved in versioning. So we will cover content negotiation versioning alone as a separate video. Because I want to demo that along with the example, which will be helpful for easier understanding. And that is commonly used for Spring Boot application that has gained its popularity these days. So I'll cover it as a separate video. So please do like, comment, share and subscribe if you like the content. Thanks for watching. Crack it.